So let's talk a little bit about investments. Okay, so which is better? Value investing? That means buying stocks when they're falling and they look cheap. I'm guessing 98% of you guys are more comfortable with this approach. Or growth and momentum, buying stocks when they're going up. I'm going to throw a second question into the mix. Do humans or algorithms do a better job of selecting stocks? Before I get started, please read the disclaimer at the end of this video. Past performance is no indication of future performance. Let's start out with the S&P 500, including dividends. Now that's a pretty tough act to follow. For those of you who are new to my vlogs, anything in the upper left corner is good, and anything in the lower right corner is bad. And for now, we're only going to look back over the previous 10 years. Okay, if we first look at the iShares ETF, IVW, which by the way invests in S&P 500 growth stocks, it did significantly better than the S&P over the last 10 years. Let's compare that to the iShares ETF, IVE, which invests in S&P 500 value stocks. It's pretty obvious it underperformed both the growth ETF and the S&P 500 with dividends. What's really amazing about this analysis is the two things value investors strive for, fewer losses and more returns, were both worse over this period. And look, if you don't believe me, just ask the famous value investor Warren Buffett, who had his worst year in 2015 when he was down almost 12% for the year. So IVW and IVE invest in S&P 500 large cap stocks. Well, what if we look at mid-cap stocks? Maybe they perform differently. As you can see, investing in the iShares Mid-Cap Growth ETF, IWP, performed better than the iShares Mid-Cap Value ETF, IWS. And this is just like the relationship between the S&P 500 Growth and Value ETFs that we looked at earlier. So now let's look over a longer time period by going back 16 years. Back to when both of these S&P 500 growth and value ETFs began. As you can see here, the value ETF, IVE, outperformed the growth ETF, IVW, but both had worse loss characteristics than the S&P 500 with dividends over that same period. Another and maybe better way to see this for some of you is to look at the time series graphs for these three ETFs over the previous 10-year period, and then we'll take a look at the same three ETFs over the earlier 6-year period from 2000 to 2006. As you can see from the graph of the 10-year period, the growth ETF IVW clearly outperformed both the S&P and the value ETF IVE. And to drive home the point about 2015 being a very difficult year, here's a graph of just 2015, and you can see that the value ETF was down about 10% for the year. Really tough year for investments in general, but especially if you were a value investor like Warren Buffett. And now when you look at the earlier period from 2000 to 2006, the value ETF, IVE, clearly outperforms the growth ETF, IVW. So the answer to our first question, which is better, value or growth investing? It's clear value investing was the better choice in the earlier part of this 16-year time frame. It totally outperformed growth from 2000 to 2006. And I think this is in large part because of the dot-com bubble, which were all growth stocks that burst back in the early 2000s. But in the latter period of 10 years, growth investing clearly outperformed value investing. So they each work better at certain times, which doesn't explain why there are more value investors than growth investors. I'll cover this topic in a future video. Now let's look at the second question. Do humans or algorithms do a better job of picking stocks, either for growth or value investments? For this experiment, I was only able to get 10 years worth of 500 stocks into Excel before Excel decided to blow up. So I only have this data going back for 10 years, but I think the results are pretty compelling and will carry backward into the 2000 to 2006 timeframe. First, let's perform a very difficult feat, and that is selecting the best 7 stocks to be in from a growth perspective and then from a value perspective. As you can see here, our natural selection algorithms blew away the S&P 500 and the iShares growth and value ETFs in terms of return with slightly more drawdown. Okay, so you say, well, that's easy because the iShares ETFs have to invest in over 100 stocks to support a large amount of assets under management, or AUM. Okay, I'll give you that. But let's look at the same natural selection algorithms and how they performed when we put 150 stocks in each of the portfolios. Keep in mind, this is 30% of the S&P 500. So it should be a good comparison between the iShares ETFs and our natural selection algorithms. Again, the natural selection algorithms blew away the iShares ETFs in terms of return with slightly more drawdown. Look, it's clear from our 2 experiments, the answers to our questions are: 1, value investing works better sometimes and growth investing works better other times, and the periods of outperformance tend to last for many years, so being one way or the other may not serve you well. And second, algorithms do a much better job of picking either value or growth stocks. In one of my later vlogs, I'll talk about why the human emotional component makes it better to be a growth investor than a value investor, regardless of the time period. Hey, thank you for watching today, and please click on the subscribe button below. That's all for now.
Yeah, to the day I die. I think she's gonna be following me. I get worried. Hey, who's that waiting there? Who's that down the street? Yeah, look, that's her. I think I'm gonna go out the back way. Now, I'll see y'all later. Oh, I ain't going out there.